Shirin,
Thank you for having me.
where are you right now? When did you leave New York, and what did you bring to Upstate? Because we say this is a studio visit. So when did you leave, and how did you leave, and how do you work right now?
Well, about a month ago, when things got really bad, and I was in somewhat of a denial that things are as serious as it is, and I was still going out and everything, and slowly, we realized that it is very, very serious. And Shoja, my husband, knows how social I am. I'm always outside. So he insisted that we rush and pack and leave our home, and my son instead came to stay at our place. But what really happened, I think I took 2 pairs of hands, and in terms of artwork, I just took a few small pieces that I could do here, because I figured be 2-3 weeks. And I have to say that I haven't been here in this house for a long time, and I'm a very city person, and I'm not really someone who's out in nature so often. And but now a month has passed, and our life has been completely redefined.
Are you in contact with your local friends in New York?
So I have to say I feel somewhat guilty, because I'm healthy and Shoja is, and we're in this very privileged home. But many of my friends went on to get ill. Some of the people I work with, some of them very mild, a few of them pretty serious. We lost one person, and there are a number of friends of mine that are back and forth between the hospital, and a lot of these people are young. And then on the other hand, of course, in my country, in Iran, this has been going on even longer than here. And so my family I've been speaking with every day. They've been in lockdown for 4 months. It's just this very strange period of every day waking up to the calls to see if everyone is healthy, and if they have enough food, if they have enough medical care, or and then the news, and there's a paradox in being in this beautiful nature, isolated, but also have this extreme feeling of guilt and anxiety about what is happening in the cities. And so I'm very conflicted about whether I should have left or I should have stayed.
And you say your family is in lockdown in Iran for like 4 months. How do they say that feels? Because we are now in lockdown 5.5 weeks. How are they doing after 4 months?
The difficulty is that in Iran, unfortunately, the government, it's not being very helpful in terms of providing the right system of medical care like in the US. So everyone has having to take the measure themselves. And so like my mother lives alone with someone, and she's in her late 80s, and no one has visited her for 4 months, and she's been completely alone. And so another sister of mine has some issues with her lungs, so she's been alone in the house for 4 months. And then I have another sister who's got grandchildren and children, and they are sticking together. So I think in different degrees over there, especially because they know that they're on this on their own. The government is a little bit on denial, and it's not being very forefront about the severity of the situation. So unless they take it seriously and just stay home, they are very easily able to get infected. So it's been really a battle for Iranian people, because they're in the dark. The information is not very transparent. So no one knows how many people died. Nobody really knows how many people are infected. And the government already announced as of today, people should go back to work, and people really are afraid about that. But the economy is collapsing, and the sanctions are really hard on the people. So the government is really pressing people to go to work, but people are really confused.
Yeah. As an artist, I got a beautiful note from a fellow artist of yours, basically saying, don't despair. As an artist, you're always standing in front of an empty day and try to fill it. You go to your studio and you fill it. How, as an artist, do you feel you can produce, or do you use this time more to reflect and reset and reconsider? How can you be productive? How do you feel about this?
Well, it's very interesting because I see a lot of change in myself within this month. First of all, the way I work is very orchestrated with a studio, with a few people. First of all, I have a hard time concentrating and really the idea of career or making art seems like an access. But what I have found myself doing is carrying on with my iPhone and video, making videos and photographs of the smallest little things that normally my eyes don't really pay attention to. And I feel that, so I have brought a few small boxes of photographs to work on, but I haven't even opened them. But instead, I'm finding myself doing things like when I first started as an artist, like just playing, like I'm not a painter, but I found myself painting on Polaroids, or I found myself photographing still life, or I found myself walking nature walks looking for strange bugs and birds and things, life in the middle of, and so it's very interesting how I, for the first time, see in this solitude a certain capability that I didn't think I had in me as an artist. And I don't see this as work of art or anything serious, but I do see that there's a certain meaning behind this work. And I'm started to question about my normal practice that is always so highly produced versus just making work that is very spontaneous. It's not so precious. It's very small. It could be just the smallest little thing that my eyes wouldn't see it. So this is something that has been happening to me. I'm also reading more. I'm watching more films, and I've just been, I guess, more reflective about everything. Yeah. And now that a lot of this also got canceled, and so I have to say that there are some good things coming out of this period for me, really questioning my own artistry and practice, but also how you can make content out of the smallest little incident of your surroundings.
What you're saying about reading and watching, so 5+ weeks in lockdown, I just reflected on how could I have spent these 5 weeks without all the literature, and I made a list of which music I liked at which time in my life, which period in my life, and I bought this huge piece of paper. I wrote down a chronology of where I lived and what I did and which apartment I lived in, and also which music and which movies. So I'm watching a lot of things that I used to watch. And so to cut the matter short, how would we have survived these 5 weeks without art in all its form, visual art and cinema? So it's a living proof. I'm always saying a museum is an art is as important as a school and as a library. So that's a living proof, that is. For me, I'm missing, in the early 90s, when you and I met, Hans Ulrich and I, we were like two caricature figures because we used to do so many studio visits. And I remember there was a cartoon about kind of how many studio visits did you do today? And it was like we had 50. One was perhaps the low point of this. But I felt that for me as a person working with artists, what I don't have art, but what I miss is working with artists, talking with artists, and learning what they do. So despite the fact that this is a very severe and such a unprecedented time, I felt, and that's the reason I started this, I thought that sharing this activity of a studio visit is actually something that one should hold on to. Because you could say, oh, we should focus on other things, but I think it's important. And that said, I think we should also keep the format. You and I talked a bit about the format. In that time, in the early 90s, we used to do a format where a studio visit always started with like questions like, when did you decide to become an artist and what were your first works? So in the tradition that some templates are actually great, I would like to start the official studio visit. Like, let's talk about art, because that's why this group found together, right? And we prepared a slideshow also with videos of works that you feel are very important. Some works I felt are very important in your career. But my first question is, when did you actually decide to become an artist? When did you know you could not be an artist?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that certainly art school was not the answer for me. I think when I decided to be an artist is when I found a way of putting all my vulnerabilities as a human being into something meaningful that was not just serving my personal interest in terms of raising many, many questions that I had in terms of the life that I had lived, everything that I had to go through as a person that was a product of a revolution, and I was living in exile and isolation. And so my work became a sort of a tool to connect my own anxieties and vulnerabilities and finding a form of expression that it didn't become autobiographical, but as an art form, it became a dialogue about a larger issues and a work of aesthetic, and just what we're talking about today. During this period, I'm thinking about how every one of us are confronted with our own anxieties and vulnerabilities, but then we're worried about the world, and we're worried about our friends, we're worried about our communities, and I think that my work has always been about that moments where I feel that there is something that I'm tapping onto that not only serves a purpose for me as a way of framing many questions, it may consequently frame questions and raise interest of other people in a very deeper level. And so I think I was already 31 after I had a son, where I finally said, I got it. I can become an artist. Forget my education, forget everything I was trained. Now I found the urgency, the issues that I feel like I can contribute. I think that's what it was, where before I felt like I was taught to just climb ladders and, find a certain style, and it was meaningless to me. But there was a moment where both thematically and aesthetically, I arrived at something that I said, okay, I have something here, and I want to explore that and take that further. And this is in 1993, when my son was 3 years old.
That is exactly when we started working with each other, in the early 90s. And we prepared a slideshow, perhaps start looking at works. And so we have the first slide. I hope everybody can see it. If we go to the first slide, it's just our template. And we start with Women of Allah from 93. It's dated 93 to 97. Here we have it, just as a little title. So here we are looking at two very, very iconic pieces of yours. And of course, the extremities, the feet and the hands, have an incredibly feet-hand face. Everything that if you cover yourself is still visible. And do you want to say a bit about these these two pieces here, they're so iconic.
Well, when I first started to finally go back to Iran after 11 years of absence because of the revolution and the relationship between Iran and US had broken down, but finally I was able to travel to Iran. I became very obsessed with the foundation, or let's say the ideological nature of the Islamic Revolution, and I started to really focus on the concept of martyrdom. A concept that was actually very popular and institutionalized during the revolution. And just to make it more complicated, I was very dumbfounded by the fact that even the women, some religious women, also chose to be militant and participate in the revolution, and they were armed. And I found immediately a sense of paradox in a way that the woman that we know, Islamic woman that we know, usually are very submissive, passive, and sort of a victim. And here they're armed, they're very erotic images, but they're very violent. And this intersection between eroticism, sensuality, feminism, and yet, fanaticism, and this obsession with death and fate and self-sacrifice by a woman that gives life. So for me, these images were really not providing any kind of justification or endorsing or criticizing, but a sort of a phenomenon for me as a philosophical, ideological ideas that anyone who would stand in that intersection of love and fate, and yet cruelty and death and violence. And I was very much criticized later. Yes.
Where did you make these pieces? Because I remember we did work on an exhibition called The State of Things, the L'état des choses, and we presented those in Berlin at the time. But where did you actually make them?
I actually shot this in New York. So what happened, I would go to Iran, I would do all my research, and then I would come, I only managed to go 3-4 times after the revolution before I became exiled. But all of these were shot in New York. And mind you, Klaus, only a few handful of people like yourself knew me as an artist. So I was not active very much, and I posed for the photographs, and that's my son, Cyrus, that posed for that photograph. So there was a performative quality to this work where naturally living in New York, I suppose I was very influenced by, people like Cindy Sherman, Frida Kahlo. And so although the foundation of the themes were very Iranian and Islamic, the conceptual nature of the work was very Eurocentric Western art. So it's because this is where I lived. I lived downtown New York. So this was a very interesting paradox as well.
I remember when we first met in Berlin, you showed me this traditional hand tattoos. I think they're done with henna, or they're not tattoos. It's a drawing on the hand. And I remember because I asked, I remember I asked you, and that was perhaps I don't know, in a rush or not thinking straight. I said, did you paint the faces, or did you draw and write over the photograph? And then you showed me these henna, these beautifully ornate hands as an answer. And perhaps I was not the only one asking this, but I think bringing this. Do you want to say a little bit about scripture, tradition, the body? And you see one of the pictures. If we go one slide back, it looks like an earring, but of course it's not an earring. That's a gun, right? So it's ornamentation, it's jewelry, and I remember we did a lecture then, and you talked beautifully about it, but do you want to elaborate in 2 or 3 sentences about this? Because I think it's very important.
Yeah, so the woman of Allah, there was every single image had 4 elements. was the weapon that suggested the violence, the veil that was very obviously a symbol of the women who were religious, and both represented idea of repression, but solidarity with the religion. The female body, that was very problematic, obviously, for being central. And then the text that was all written poetry by Iranian women that suggested both their emotional and intellectual capability. So I basically, in every single image, there were those four elements. And the texts were never sacred texts from the Quran. They were always feminist poetry. And that I was never trained as a calligrapher, but I was really, really infatuated by the history of the use of text and its integration in Islamic art, in architecture, in vessels, in decorative objects, to carpets, to manuscripts, to to miniature paintings. So the integration of image and text is a fundamental part of the both classic Persian and Islamic art. And so it's really, in a way, an elaboration of something that I grew up with, except that this is very directly relating to the current Islamic Republic of Iran period.
Yeah, I remember showing these and how controversial they were at the time. And at the time right now, I think we have caught up with your art. And right now, in your recent exhibition at the Broad, they looked like very classical works of art that everybody recognized as your work. But I remember they were quite controversial and not necessarily liked at the time. I don't want to be in any way critical because you and I showed them, but I remember that they were not liked. That changed in the Harald Seemann Biennial, Venice Biennial 1999. You had a breakthrough success. You were the star of the 99 Biennial in Venice. And we also installed both of these pieces in New York then. We were both in New York then later. So perhaps we go to the next and go one further. We go to Turbulent. And you were kind enough to give us some video. Perhaps we should run the video because I think it's so impressive. And we have another clip. And one more, so to just, and I remember when we installed it, you were so precise. I remember installing it, you were so precise because you bring in rhythm, you bring in music, you bring in a very clearly defined sense of cinematography and timing. And this had to be incredibly well represented also in terms, of course, of the soundscape and the music. Do you want to say a bit how you came from the photographic work to this groundbreaking piece?
Yes, I mean, The Woman of Allah was one of the most misunderstood series of work, although, and it's been talked about and analyzed thousands of different ways. And I think a lot of people just didn't quite get my point of view, why I was making it. The government thought I was criticizing them. Iranians thought I was supporting the government. The art world thought that I was sensationalizing violence. And I think subconsciously I came to a point where I realized that I need to get away from the realism in the way that I had approached it with The Woman of Allah. And also the idea of making several editions of the same photograph, I felt like I was just making commodities. So it came with the videos, particularly with the Turbulent, which was really one of the first ones. It was a great freedom of being able to step out of the studio, to be able to incorporate landscape, music, choreography, performance, story, and actually collaborate with a number of different people. And that although the main topic was about the fact that the women are absent in the music industry, or women are forbidden to publicly perform music while the men are, sociologically it started with that note, but it went to so many other places. The work was succeeded to be much more layered than the kind of work that I felt that I made earlier, and that I didn't have to translate the concept to my Western audience. Everybody understood it. Music, the way that it spoke to the people, also neutralized some of the political dimension of the work. So I just really finally got it that, yes, I can still make a work that is very stylized, very aesthetic. Every frame is a photograph. And so it's the same form of compositions, but I can liberate myself from that attachment to realism, where people cannot distract themselves from their own perception and point of view about political subjects. You know what I mean? Although this is a form of critique of the Iranian government because it's discrimination between male and female, but by using music as a vehicle to discuss that, it was a different conversation, you see. I couldn't be, the judgment, it was different.
The 99 biennial Harald Seeman's last biennial had two main messages. He opened up the biennial for contemporary art from China. It was a huge breakthrough, it's a huge portion, and he opened up contemporary art into large-scale video installations, large-scale multi-channel video. I remember Electric Earth from Doug Aitken took half of the Arsenale, and your work, this work, was a breakthrough success. So at the time, it was a formal innovation to have these incredibly cinematic, perfect sound installations in the visual art context. That was a breakthrough. But I remember also, and I'm coming to the next slide, also the role of you as a female artist and of women in Iran, and we're going to the other slide. I want to show the next video, Rapture from '99. We can watch that. So we have 3 little clips as well with sound. It feels like you're treating basically in these works, you're treating men and women like 2 different populations, like 2 separate populations, reflecting on society where your family is from, and in a larger context. At the moment, that was a big focus on your work. And then at some point, you left this behind. In your work going forward, you're more of an observer of inequalities, you're more an observer of vulnerable populations, but you basically moved forward from this. What brought you there, Shirin?
Yeah, I think that it's very interesting choices that you made to go from The Woman of Allah to Turbulent to Rapture, because you can see how progressively I let go more and more of realism, and
Yeah.
the work becomes much more ritualistic. And even though it's still, there is very much focus on the Islamic culture, the whole issue of the masculine versus the feminine, and all of that, that it's a very important part of the piece. But I think the work starts going in a very much more surrealistic, almost very stylized way. I mean, with me, Rapture was like a dance choreography, in the way that the woman moved in nature and the men in the fortress. And I never saw that in myself as an artist, to be able to go from those still pictures to where I can have 100 men and 100 women, and to be able to create this imagery. And so for me, it was an incredible exercise of the potential of telling stories without protagonists, one single protagonist. I had always on each side a group of men versus a group of women. And so I gave myself this parameter of what I will do and what I will not do. And it was incredibly exciting, because I learned about creating videos that became a kind of rituals that are not, they're not realistic. But in these rituals, there are all these references to reality and to socio-political issues, religious issues, feminist issues. But at the same time, they transcend all of that, and they become rather universal and timeless. And I think the reason Turbulent and Rapture was embraced by the Western art world was because they truly understood it. It didn't need translation, you know. And I think I started to begin, I understood the potential of making work that can function in that way, that although it starts very ethnically specific, it goes places where it leaves all of that definitions behind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to quickly show a couple of pieces from other works, and I show a group of them, and then perhaps we go to the next. It feels like with slideshows, it always brings you back to school in a way. The Book of Kings. I'm just going through those slides. We go to this next body of work, Our House is on Fire. And I would like you to say a little bit, perhaps the next slide, about these two bodies of work, especially the last one here. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, so I have to give a look, because there was a big gap between the time I made Rapture and this series, that I got so infatuated by the moving picture that I even went on to make 2 feature-length films. Woman Without Men was in 2009, and later on another film. But at some point I missed still photography. I missed the use of my hands in doing the calligraphy, and but also it turned out that I'm also very interested in history. And if Woman of Allah was related to the Islamic Revolution, the Book of Kings was about the uprising of the Green Movement in 2009, where we saw a huge amount of young people pouring in the streets of Tehran and asking for some form of democracy. And the later work, as here is called Our House is on Fire, is about the Egyptian revolution, where this is a series of people that I photographed in the aftermath of the revolution near Tahrir Square. And this is a big shift, Klaus, because I shifted the idea of taking pictures of myself or models, and now I started to photograph real people. And I went to Cairo, and I recruited people who had some tragic events happening to them in the aftermath of the revolution. They told me their stories. I told them some of my stories, and we had this exchange. And they cried, and what is written on their faces is actually what they told me about the losses that they had. I mean, this was also criticized about, yes, of course, this is depicting the poor, the suffering, people whose children were lost, and so it's sort of capturing the pain of the others. But I felt there was this sincerity of an exchange between me and my subject that I've never experienced in, you know, bringing people to a studio and photograph like myself or someone else. So this became an opening to a new world for me, where I will actually step out into the world and take pictures of people, and that I will literally interview them.
What I described this work once is you stepped from fiction into documentation. You stepped from
Exactly.
From choreographed, fictitious, cinematic, or photographic imaginations and creations of you. Here, these are real people and you're documenting them. And perhaps we go to the next body of work, The Home of My Eyes. And we show a little bit. This is such a beautiful installation view. And I go even one more further to Rocha. And this is a video clip. Perhaps we watch this quickly. Such incredibly beautiful imagery. Coming to this, we have one last video clip here.
Come up here right now. Don't be afraid. It's going to happen sooner or later. It's going to happen now. Come up here so that your life...
If we stay with Rocha, how would you define the relationship between fiction and documentation, between a created narrative and a reported narrative? How would you describe this in this body of work that we just saw these beautiful clips from?
It's very interesting, because you just made me realize that when it comes to my photography, I tend to be gravitating toward like a reporter, a kind of a documentary photographer, where I really get close to my subjects and get to know them, and we make something together. But then when it comes to film and video, they're becoming more and more about magic realism, surrealism, and about dreams. And so I, for example, consider the group of portraits that I made with The Home of My Eyes, Our House is on Fire, the Book of Kings, are portraits of nations. I see them not about a single protagonist, but the way in which all of the portraits together represent that country, or that moment of the history of that country. And especially later with The Land of Dreams that we'll talk about. But with the videos, I found that there's something that really fascinated me about with The Woman Without Men, the film that I readapted, a magic realist novel, into a feature film. I found the strength of that kind of storytelling, that kind of language, where you can still have a footing on reality and realism and references to places and that you have been or people you know, but nothing quite makes sense. And there is something about all of us that, you know, we have those states in our dreams and or our state of madness. And so I found with the language of surrealism, magic realism, and dreams, I can get closer to being far more universal and far more enigmatic, but yet accessible to the people from different parts of the world, you know? Because, you know,
I also think from that very first moment you and I talked, and we talked about the henna tattoos, I was made aware that for you, form and finding form is, of course, that's so important for every artist, but you are always true to your form. And as different as the pieces are, the very first, then the more choreographed, music-driven cinematography, then the social inquiries and studies, then your research works, then the magical realism. What is a constant is that you found your form very early on, and you're always true to your form. And if it is fiction, or if it is imaginative, or it is reporting, you keep everything consistent and together with that very iconic form that you developed. And I would like to perhaps, because I want to talk about what you're working on currently, and it's so fascinating to learn more about and to share more about what you thought about other pieces. But I want to go to the next, Land of Dreams, which is last year. It's a world that we don't know anymore, but let's go through here. I would love to show this piece. Of course, it's so iconic, and we go to the next, perhaps. Let's go through these, and then perhaps you tell us a little bit about your thinking in this body of work. It's absolutely fascinating. And if you go one slide back, you actually see, you see the nuclear explosion. You see the nuclear explosion in the photo. One slide back. You see the nuclear explosion in that little photograph that the man has on his cupboard back there, where he has his army photo, and then you have the unfortunate historic documentation of such a catastrophe. So we go further through this body of work. It's fascinating imagery. And we go forward and further and further. Great, and we end this perhaps with the last slide. What would you say a bit more about this? Because I'm sure everybody saw this in your recent big retrospective, but still, it's still fascinating to hear you talk about it.
First of all, Klaus, I always see myself as partially an activist who really cares about the world and worries about the world. And part of me feels like a poet. I care a lot about emotions and everything that is very ephemeral. And so I see that in every work that I have made, there's this pull between mysticism and beauty and aesthetic, and yet pain and violence and revolutions, etc. So in this project, The Land of Dreams, every idea and every form that I have ever worked on collapsed into one project, if that makes sense. First of all, the character, which is my own double, is a photographer. So right off the bat, she's taking pictures. So we see her obsession with photography. And then in the videos, again, it becomes very enigmatic, black and white videos that I've done before in earlier videos. But yet my film work, the cinematic interest, is introduced in video, where there's a narrative development, there's language, there's a protagonist, there's a beginning, middle, and the end. And then on top of that, I think thematically, it touched on so many different issues. First off the bat is this notorious tension between Iran and the United States, the non-ending tension that it's been unresolved, and then functioning as a sort of an absurd political satire that, in my mind, that was the best way to tackle it. There was this secret colony of Iranian people in lab coats where they're hidden in this mountain, in this industrial space, making believe that they're making atomic bomb, but in fact they're just reviewing and interpreting American people's dreams. And she, disguising herself she's an agent or spy for the colony, but disguising herself as an artist or art student, going to different American people's homes to collect their portraits, but then getting their dreams. But consequently, she becomes emotionally engaged and relates and identifies with these people's dreams and nightmares, and finds out that these American people's dreams and nightmares are actually not that different than her own, which really speaks a lot about what we're going through today in this global phenomenon of corona. Is our nightmares, our anxieties, our fear of mortality, and it's just so global, and it's
Shirin,
interesting that at the end
Shirin, would you mind if we shared the last batch of slides of Colony? What you just said brought me to that. You said like these things look like visions of what we are going through in times of Corona. I held back. When you're on Netflix, it always says what are the most watched movies, and one is Outbreak from the 90s, and the other one is Contagion from 2011. Two crazy movies about outbreaks. And then last weekend, I thought perhaps it's actually interesting to compare fiction with, or imagined. It would be interesting to see how a director imagined something in the 90s and 10 years ago about something we are in. And I watched both of them, and they are shockingly accurate about a couple of things. So when we go here through your incredible body of work, The Colony, look at this. This looks so dystopian. And let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next. Where do you take this from here? This already feels like a premonition.
This is the library. Yes. This was, are you asking me about the scene?
Asking you about this body of work and how you're going forward, or how you were imagining going forward before the crisis hit us.
So exactly what I had always in mind, that I would make two videos and a group of photographs that she took, which she is this whole film is about my experience, and she's actually playing me. But I also had a script that we are hoping to shoot into a movie, which we were supposed to shoot actually this June. So I thought Land of Dreams would include a photographic installation, which is 110 photographs that at the Broad, some of our friends may have seen. That was this immersive installation of all the people I shot in New Mexico, of different racial backgrounds, different gender, different ages. 2 videos, one Colony and one the American town, and then a feature-length version of film that would be 2 hours. So we're right now in the middle of fundraising and trying to cast and trying to make it happen. And I think even if we don't shoot it in June, which we obviously couldn't, we could do later in the summer or the fall or even later. For me, that's not really the issue. But I wanted to know, even in terms of the languages of cinema and art, how I could now tell the story in a 2-hour. And the script is written by Jean-Claude Carrier, who is an 89-year-old scriptwriter who worked with Louis Buñuel and is French.
Yeah. And let's go through the last slides. I think we have some more, and then we go a little bit faster if we can, because I would like to open up the round with everybody again. So also everybody can have the opportunity to have a question for you. I think it's such a privilege that you and we know each other for like 100 years, but with a group of guests joining us, we can ask us these questions that sometimes, of course, we know the answers, but we have a good reason to ask it again. It's really, I'm very grateful that we go through this. It's fascinating. And I think we will also have an installation view here. I remember this at the Broad. It was like this. Yeah, here we have we selected the one with the staircase here. But I remember at the Broad, it was like 3 walls with a frontal wall, and which was quite amazing.
Yes, this is not at the.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shirin. That was very, very beautiful. Thank you.